Hey guys, here is the promised final video that goes along with my class lecture today and along with the notes set 6, relative clauses, and the passive voice. And this goes along with your lesson and your test as well, which are upcoming. So first of all, let's start out by reviewing the passive voice, which we haven't talked about in a while. So the basic difference between the passive and the active voice, remember the 5 properties of the Latin verb: person, number, tense, voice, and mood. Voice, there are only 2 voices, active and passive, and they have to do with the relationship between the subject and the verb. So in an active construction, the subject is the doer of the action, right? So John loves Mary. John is doing the loving. And the direct object is the receiver of the action, Mary, right? Now, in a passive construction, what you've got is you've got a situation in which you're sort of flipping things around and you're making the subject the receiver of the action rather than the doer of the action. So if you said, instead of John loves Mary, you said Mary is loved, then you would have a passive construction. And you can reshape the whole idea of John loves Mary, so you can say the same thing in a passive form. So you can't have a direct object in the passive, but what you can do is you can make the doer of the action the subject in the active form. You can make that into a prepositional phrase. So you can say Mary is loved, and then you can say by John. And you've got the whole essence of the thought. So you can take John loves Mary and turn the whole thing inside out and backwards and make it into a passive form. Mary is loved by John. See, there, Mary is the subject because it's a passive construction, whereas she's the direct object in the active construction. So, particular things to remember about the passive form in Latin. Remember those endings for verbs that we learned: ris, tur, mor, mini, intur, ris, tur, mor, mini, intur. Those are the passive endings for the imperfective tenses, for the regular tenses, the top 3 in the chart, if you will, for present, imperfect, and future. So if you want to say I love, that's active, that's amo. If you want to say I am loved, that's passive. You add the R to the end of it. So amor, amaris, amatur, amamor, and so on. If you want to do all that in the imperfect, I was loved, or I was being loved, then you just add a BA in between. So instead of amor, it's amabor. Okay? And let's try it with the third person singular because that's more regular. So amat is he loves. Amatur, now I've made the active into a passive, is he is loved or is being loved. Then I can make that amatur, he is loved, into he was loved or he used to be loved. And that would be imperfect. So amabatur. Amatur becomes amabatur. And if I want to say he will be loved, then I put a bi instead of a ba in there. Caution. For the future tense, it's not always bi, just several times it's bi. So you'll want to check your paradigm in Jenny's. But it's amabitur means he will be loved. So amatur, amabatur, amabitur. I am loved, I was loved, I will be loved. So that takes care of 3 of the different tenses, because remember the passive voice has all 6 tenses just like the active voice does. Now, one thing that you'll want to bear in mind is that the meanings of the passive voice throughout the tenses are a little bit confusing in English. And so let me give you some tips and tricks, because you're going to be translating from English to Latin, from Latin to English, or at least figuring out what the correct translations are, so you want to bear these things in mind. For present, you could say I am loved, but you can also say I am being loved. For imperfect, you can say I was loved, that's plain old past, or you can say I used to be loved, or you can say I was being loved. All of those, or he was, or we were being loved, any of those permutations there with the pronouns. For future, you can say I will be loved, but you can also say I will be being loved. For perfect, you can say I was loved, as you can also say for the imperfect, but you can say I have been loved, or I have been being loved. And remember that for third person singular, the have changes to has. So I have been loved, right? But he has been loved. It's the same tense, both perfect. For pluperfect, you say I had been loved, or I had been being loved. And for future perfect, I will have been loved, or I will have been being loved. So one thing that can get confusing, because you've got all these different forms with all these different words in them in English, is sometimes you can become confused and not be able to tell the difference between active and passive, because there's so many different words and they're swimming around in your head. So here's a tip that can help you, okay? If you see ed on the end of the last word, on the end of the participle there, then it's passive. And if you see ing on the end, then it's active. So if you said I am being loved, or I am loved, that is passive. But if you said I am loving, that is active, because you're doing the loving there. And if you say I am loved, you're receiving the love. So that's passive. Don't let the simple past confuse you, though. So if you say I loved, not I am being loved, but I loved, just a single word there, that's active, right? And I loved versus I was loved, that's the passive form. So now we've been through the first three of the perfect tenses. This is a little out of order, and I hope you'll forgive me. Let's talk about the first three of the tenses of the passives, the imperfective tenses, present, future, and present, imperfect, and future. And now I'm going to review with you how to do perfect tenses, because perfect tenses in the passive are really, really different, not only from how you do the imperfective tenses, present, imperfect, and future, but they're also different from how you do the perfect tenses, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, in the active. Remember, perfect tenses in the active form use the third principal part. So you would start with amo, amare, amavi, amatum. You'd start with amavi, amavisti, amave, and that's your perfect. If you wanted to make pluperfect, amaveram, amaveras, etc. But if you want to make them passive, then you don't use the third principal part. If you want to make perfect tenses, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, in the passive voice, you have to use the fourth principal part plus sum. So, and not only have to do that, but you have to make the participle agree with the subject in gender, case, and number, because it's an adjective. So, for example, if you wanted to say he was loved, you'd use the perfect tense and you'd say amatus sum. But if you wanted to say she was loved, then you'd say amata sum. Okay? If you wanted to say the gift, donum, doni, that's neuter, the gift was loved, then you'd say donum amatum est, right? Because it has to be amatum to match donum. If you wanted to say the farmer was loved, that's masculine, even though it looks feminine. Agricola amatus est. And the same with the plurals. You'd say agricolae amati sunt, because amati is the masculine form going along with agricolae. And you have to change the tenses for pluperfect. So instead of sum as est, it's eram, eras, eras, erat. So if you wanted to say he was loved, that would be amatus est. If you wanted to say he had been loved, amatus erat, he will have been loved, amatus erit. You might want to, rather than try to memorize all these, I doubt you'll try that, but in any case, you might want to follow along with Ginny's, along with the chapter on passives, and check your paradigms so that you don't get too confused. Okay, let's talk a little bit about relative clauses, which is the main subject that we've been giving attention to lately. But I just want to go over a few things with you so that you won't forget them when you're dealing with passives as well. So remember, relative clauses are clauses. That means they're kind of like sentences. They have subjects and verbs, especially. So that's the first thing to remember. A relative clause is not complete unless you found the verb as well as the subject. The subject will often be the relative pronoun, but not always. Okay, so don't forget, as I said, relative clauses are like sentences, but they are not sentences. They're parts of a sentence. So in a sentence that has a relative clause, you're not only going to have the relative clause itself, but you're going to have a main clause that it's linked to, right? So if you say, I see a farmer who is my friend, I see a farmer is the main clause, who is my friend is the relative clause. Is the verb in the relative clause, see is the verb in the main clause. Don't forget that relative pronouns, qui, que, quod, have to agree with their antecedent in gender and number, but not necessarily in case. So, what is an antecedent? An antecedent is the thing that the relative pronoun is referring to. So if I say, I see a farmer who is my friend, then the who is referring to the farmer, right? I see a farmer who is my friend. The who isn't talking about a bird or somebody else talking about the farmer, who is the direct object in the main clause. I see a farmer, okay? But if you say who is my friend, suddenly the who is the subject of the relative clause. So you're not going to make that accusative just because farmer is the direct object in the main clause. You are going to make it masculine and singular. So it's going to follow farmer in gender and number, but you have to think about what it's doing in the relative clause, what the relative pronoun is doing, before you figure out what case you should put it in, whether it's the subject or the direct object or something like that. So a couple of other points about relatives, more complex points. First of all, relative pronouns don't always come after the main clause. Sometimes they can come before the main clause, and as a matter of fact, you can start out a sentence with a relative pronoun. Now, if you say, I see a farmer who is my friend, you can see who was talking about a farmer. But if you say, let's say you you saw this sentence, qui me vocavit pater meus est. Qui me vocavit pater meus est. So the qui starts out the sentence, and if you're looking in front of it to see what it refers to, you won't find anything. So most of the time, what that means is that there is an implied antecedent. So qui, it says, qui me vocavit. I can tell from vocavit that the qui is singular, right? Vocavit is third person singular, it. So that would mean, and qui, that would mean that qui has to be singular. It also is got to be nominative, and it's got to be masculine. So the way you would translate qui me vocavit is he who, not just who, but he who called me, pater meus est, is my father. So if you said que me vocavit, then she who called me, mater mea est, is my mother. You could also have it be plural, right? You could have que vocaverunt, que vocaverunt, que me vocaverunt, qui me vocaverunt is fine. So those, that would be feminine. Those women who called me, or qui me vocaverunt, those guys who called me, but they who called me, amici mei sunt, are my friends, something like that. Okay, so the other thing is that as well as relative clauses sometimes beginning a sentence and you have an implied antecedent, sometimes the main clause, which you might expect to be at the beginning or the end, is on both sides, and the relative clause is in the middle, like peanut butter in a sandwich, and the main clause is in two pieces, like two pieces of bread. So suppose I said in English, I gave the man whom I saw yesterday a gift. I gave the man whom I saw yesterday a gift. So the main clause is, I gave the man a gift. And that's on both sides, you see. I gave the man whom I saw yesterday a gift. I gave the man a gift. And the relative clause is whom I saw yesterday. So you have to understand when you're trying to translate it that the main clause is sometimes in two pieces. So if you wanted to say that in Latin, you'd say dedi vero, because you're really saying I gave to the man, so it's going to be in dative. So dedi vero quem Eri vidi, so that's whom yesterday I saw. Donum, that's the direct object. The main clause is dedi viro donum, and the relative clause is quem eri vidi. Okay, don't forget that all of this that I've just given you may be in a more pleasing format as notes, which I printed up, and I've put them in your materials section as a PDF, so you can refer to them if you want to when you're taking your quiz or test or whatever you want to call it, or even while you're doing your lessons. Okay, great to talk to you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Love you.